Study Session 15, Marsilio of Padua, Thoroughgoing Materialism. Introduction. In this study session, you will learn about the efforts of those who had sympathy for the secular government to reverse the trend by placing the church back under the state. You will also focus on Marsilio of Padua, one of the scholars who contributed to this effort. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the controversy between the state and the church. 2. Identify the motives behind Marsilio's writings. 3. Explain the legacies of John of Paris upon which Marsilio built his philosophy. 4. Describe the Marsilio's theory of the state. 5. Analyze Marsilio's concept of law and legislator. Background. The effect of legal studies in the 13th century was enormous both on civil and canon law as well as on the old vague community relationship which the Gelasian theory assumed between the two powers. The canon lawyers had already created a theory of the papacy which changed the church's right of spiritual discipline into a claim of legal supervision. In the 14th century, this claim could hardly be met as it was in the 16th by a sweeping denial of the validity of canon law. What was needed firstly was a more precise analysis of the spiritual and secular authorities, and especially a more exact delimitation of the spiritual, if the papal jurisdiction was to be egged within tolerable limits. Added to this was the danger that might lurk in Aristotle's politics, especially in the theory that civil society is itself perfect and self-sufficing, not requiring sanctification by any supernatural agency. All these tendencies of disintegration made their appearances in the 14th and 15th centuries. All the old arguments reappeared and were reanalyzed. The same historical precedents were re-examined. The same landmarks, such as the donation of Constantine and the translation of the empire, were reinterpreted. This process of disintegration took place in three great processes and waves, namely: 1. The controversy between the papacy, Boniface III, and the Kingdom of France, Philip the Fair, in 1296 to 1303. In this way, the theory of papal imperialism, already well settled in the canon law and was brought to completion, was defeated by national cohesion of France. 2. Controversy of 1323 between John 22 and Louis the Bavarian some 25 years later, which crystallized opposition to papal sovereignty. 3. The Great Schism within the church. Opposition to papal absolutism took a new form. The subjects of an obsolete sovereign tried to force on him as measure of reform the limitations of constitutional and representative government. Effect of the controversies. 1. In the French controversy, the tactical positions of the two Constantines were reversed. The ecclesiastical and not the secular power was on the defensive. For this reason, it was not only the authority of the king that was on trial, but equally the papal power itself. The extent of the Pope's power in the church, the possibility of supporting a charge of heresy against him, his control of ecclesiastical property, his authority in doctrinal questions, in short, the whole question of church government and of the Pope's part in it were subject to searching criticism. 2. Not only was the nature of spiritual authority analyzed, but in the long run, the opposition to the papacy as the supreme power of the church was developed and spread broadcast, with consequences that were made fully apparent in the Protestant Reformation. 3. In the course of the controversy between Pope and John of Bavaria, the process of limiting and driving back the spiritual power to purely otherworldly function was carried as far as it could go. 4. The controversy produced a large mass of controversial and occasional literature. Papal claims. Arising from the ponderings of Augustine and Thomas, the papacy was placed above the state. This idea culminated in the series of claims by the papacy to legal supervision. The most thoroughgoing presentation of the argument for papal imperialism was contained in the De Ecclesiastica Potestate, which was written about 1302 by Egidius Colonna. These claims made by canon lawyers and which the greater popes like Innocent III had exercised included: 1. In respect to imperial elections, Innocent had claimed in his famous bull Venerabilem 1202 the right to pass upon the fitness of the elected candidate and also to review disputed or irregular elections. 2. In his dealing with other ruler, Innocent III had sought to establish papal jurisdiction in special questions or even special classes of persons. Thus, he had claimed the power to confirm and adjudicate treaties and agreements between rulers on the theory that the church had special jurisdiction over oaths. 3. There was claim to general guardianship over war and peace and the right to oblige contesting parties to submit to arbitration. 4. A special guardianship over widows and minors and special powers for the suppression of heresy, including the right to confiscate heretics' property and to exclude them from office. 5. Claim to right to discipline rulers who fail to enforce the church authority in such matters. 6. Innocent III had sought to set up a general right of supervision over the administration of justice, including the privileges of taking cases into his own courts, where the secular courts had permitted a miscarriage of justice. The essence of the theory of papacy. The essence of the theory of papacy was that it claimed for the papacy a unique power, both in the church itself and in relations of the church to secular powers, superior and different in kind from that exercised by any other authority. The Pope had plenitudo potestatis, sovereignty, because he was the vicar of Christ. This power was in a special sense divine right. It confers a peculiar superiority and power of revision, whether ecclesiastical or secular. In this sense, all power, both temporal and spiritual, resided in the church and was vested in the Pope. The theory also amounted to a claim of universal sovereignty, which made the Pope the head of the entire legal system. This papal position was stated by Boniface himself in the bull Unam Sanctum 1302. The bull asserted two main principles essential to papal position. A. The Pope was supreme in the church and subjection to him was a doctrine necessary to salvation. B. Both swords belong to the church. 1514. Decline of the papal claims. However, in the 14th century, there followed a decline of the claims of the papacy to legal supervision as a result of a sweeping denial of the validity of canon law, as well as the rise of the elements and tendencies of disintegration, which included as follows: 1. Hollowness of the pretensions of the 14th century empire to exert any real control over European politics. 2. division of the people by the nascent differences of nationality. 3. The effect of legal studies in the 13th century, both in the civil and canon laws, and on the Old Vic committee between the two parties. The canon lawyers had already created a theory of papacy which changed the claim of the papacy from church right of spiritual discipline to legal supervision. 4. The full weight of dangerous secularism that locked in Aristotle's politics, especially in the theory that civil society is itself perfect and self-sufficing, not requiring sanctification by any supernatural agency. In defense of the king, what was needed was more precise analysis of the spiritual and secular authorities, and especially a more exact delimitation of the spiritual. If the papal jurisdiction was to be egged within tolerable limits, the alternative was to deny that a spiritual force needs or could have a legal structure. The spiritual must be restricted so far as possible to the duty of moral and religious institution, with the result in the end that the civil government on its side became purely a secular institution. Thus, in the 13th century, there appeared the conception, wholly novel so far as the earlier medieval tradition is concerned, that law is dependent upon the enactment of the prince, and this was almost certainly due to the study of Roman law. It was to this task of reversing the position of the church vis-a-vis the state that Marcellus of Padua came to contribute. Overview of Marcellus' contribution to political philosophy. Marcello of Padua and William of Ockham were the figures of lasting importance in the history of political philosophy produced by the quarrel which began in 1323 and continued through the pontificates of John 22 and Clement 6, and was not settled until after death of Louis the Bavarian in 1347. Marcello's theory is one of the most remarkable creations of medieval political thought and showed for the first time the subversive consequences to which a completely naturalistic interpretation of Aristotle might logically lead. He wrote not to defend the emperor, but to destroy the old system of papal imperialism that had developed in the practice of Innocent III and theory of the canon law. His object was to define and limit in most drastic manner the pretension of the spiritual authority to control either directly or indirectly the actions of secular governments. To this end, he went further than any other medieval writer in placing the church under the power of the state. His object was also to seek the remedy for the cause of disorder that filled Europe, resulting from Pope's claim to supreme power. His philosophical basis is Aristotelian. Marsilio, in his introduction, evidently thought of his work as a supplement to the part of the politics which discussed the causes of revolution and civil disorder, for there was one cause necessarily unknown to Aristotle. He said, namely, the claims of the Pope to a supreme power over rulers, and especially those of recent popes, which have filled Europe, and more particularly Italy, with strife. It is the remedy for this cause of disorder that Marsilio proposed to seek. The Aristotelian principle which he followed most closely was that of the self-sufficing community capable of supplying both its physical and its moral needs. The outcome was another repudiation of the papacy's effort to set itself up as an international arbitral power. Marsilio's conception of the state. Following Aristotle, Marsilio defines the state as a kind of living being composed of parts which perform the functions necessary to its life. Its health or peace consists in the orderly working of each of its parts, and strife arises when one part does its work badly or interferes with another part. It follows the derivation of the city from the family, the city of being a perfect community or one that can supply all that is needed for a good life, self-sufficing. Still following Aristotle, Marsilio then enumerates the classes or parts which cooperate to form a society. There are farmers and artisans who supply material goods and the revenue needed for government, and there are soldiers, officials, and priests who made up the state in strict sense. The last class, the clergy, causes special difficulty, and its place in society has been subject to differences of opinion because of the twofold purpose of religion and because its other worldly purpose cannot be comprehended by reason, law, and the legislature. Marsilio carried forward into his definition of law his radical distinction of the spiritual and temporal, between divine law and human law. Divine law is a command of God directly, while human law is a command of the whole body of citizens. The two kinds of law are distinguished by kind of penalties entailed. Human law is not derived from divine law, but it is contrast with it. Any rule that involves an earthly penalty belongs to human law and has its authority from human enactment. The executive and judicial parts of government are set up by the body of citizens. In all cases, the authority of the executive is derived from the legislative act of the whole body. Within the limit of human law, there is no such thing as spiritual offense. Such offenses are judged by God only in future life, and the penalties are incurred beyond grave. He is unwilling that the Pope and the hierarchy, being merely human agents, should be permitted to pass on disputed articles of faith. He chose a general council which he regarded as the organ of the church for deciding such disputed articles of faith. Dealing with the legacies of John of Paris. Of many works written in defense of the king, the De Potestate Regia et Papali, 1302-3, of John of Paris, a Dominican and Frenchman, was historically more important. The Aristotelianism which he shared with St. Thomas was an important factor in determining his point of view and set him off quite clearly from the mock Aristotelianism of Aegidius. He argues that the church requires universality. Take two. He argues that the church requires universality, but that political authority does not. Civil society arises by a natural instinct, and men are diverse in their inclinations and interests. The natural political division is province or kingdom, and there is no need that this should be subordinated to a single head. It is true that he sometimes attributes to the emperor a somewhat shadowy universal authority, but is perfectly definite in asserting the independence of France. The self-sufficing community which he adopts from Aristotle is for him the kingdom, and he sees no difficulty in admitting as many such autonomous units as there actually are. John's Aristotelianism enables him to refuse the view of Aegidius that secular power requires the sanctification of the church in order to be legitimate. Secular power is older in time than true priesthood and not derivative from it. He adopts from Aristotle, as St. Thomas had done, the view that civil government is necessary in itself to a good life and is therefore justified by its ethical benefits, even apart from its sanction by Christianity. Hence, it is a misuse of the Aristotelian rule that the higher controls the lower, to argue that the spiritual in all respects is higher than the temporal. He does not regard this as denying the greater intrinsic worth of spiritual authority, but he uses the naturalness of secular government to support the traditional defense of the independence of temporals. John wrote especially to solve the problem of ecclesiastical property and with the purpose of marking out a middle course between two opposed errors. According to him, it is lawful for the clergy to have property as a means to doing their spiritual work, but the legal control of property vests in the secular authority. In the same spirit of clarifying issues, John deals with the distinction of the spiritual and temporal. The arguments depend on the separateness of the two authorities, each derived directly from God. It distinguishes 42 reasons which have been assigned for the subordination of secular to spiritual authority and refutes them one by one. He analyzes the spiritual authority inherent in priests and inquires what control, if any, this implies over temporal goods and secular power. Coercion belongs to the secular arm. Study session summary. In this study session, you have learned that 1. Arising from the ponderings of Augustine and Thomas, the papacy was placed above the state, an idea which culminated in a series of claims by the papacy to legal supervision. 2. In the 14th century, there followed a decline of the claims of the papacy to legal supervision as a result of a sweeping denial of the validity of canon law, as well as the rise of the elements and tendencies of disintegration. 3. This process of disintegration took place in three great processes and waves. 4. In the French controversy, the tactical positions of the two contestants were reversed. The ecclesiastical and not the secular power was on the defensive. 5. Marsilio of Padua and William of Ockham were the figures of lasting importance in the history of political philosophy produced by the quarrel between the papacy and the kings. 6. Marsilio's object was to define and limit in most drastic manner the presentation. Take 2. 6. Marsilio's object was to define and limit in most drastic manner the pretension of the spiritual authority to control either directly or indirectly the actions of secular governments, and to this end he went further than any other medieval writer in placing the church under the power of the state. End of ADS 207. Thank you for listening.